Welcome to Yehoshua's Daf Yomi Shiur, where the Daf continues daily until the complete revelation of Mashiach ben David, Messiah the son of David. Today we'll be studying Tractate Chullin, page 85, starting with 85a at the top of the page. We're in the middle of something, so if you want to get the idea of what's happening, you can look at the previous Daf. 84b on this channel. The top of the page, 85a, says, Ella Safek Ish Safek Isha. Rather, it must be that the uncertainty in the case of the sounding of the shofar concerns whether a particular individual is a man or a woman. For example, a tumtum whose sexual organs are indeterminate. Although a woman is not obligated in the mitzvah of sounding the shofar, a tumtum is in fact obligated despite the uncertainty of sex. It is therefore possible to derive from the sounding of the shofar that if one slaughters a koi, an animal whose status as a domesticated or undomesticated animal is uncertain on a festival, one covers its blood. ורבי יוסי לטמא דאמר אישה ודויס נמי תקעו דתניו בני ישראל סומכין ולא בנויס ישראל סומכויס. The Gemara notes, and Rabbi Yossi, who does not accept this refutation, conforms to his standard line of reasoning, as he says, one who is definitely a woman may also sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, as it is taught in a Braita concerning the verse that discusses a burnt offering. Speak to the sons of Israel, and he shall place his hands upon the head of the burnt offering. Leviticus 1, 2-4. The verse indicates that the sons of Israel place their hands upon the head of an offering, but the daughters of Israel do not place their hands. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say it is optional for women to place their hands on the head of an offering before it is slaughtered. Even though women are not obligated to place their hands, doing so is not considered to be performing labor with a sacrificial item, an act normally prohibited, despite the fact that one performs the placing of the hands by leaning with all of his weight on the animal. Similarly, Rabbi Yossi holds that although women are not obligated in the sounding of the shofar, it is optional for them to sound it, and it is not considered a desecration of the festival. Ravina said, and even according to what the sages said, that a woman may not sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but a tumtum is nevertheless obligated due to uncertainty. There is a refutation to their claim as well. One cannot derive from this that the obligation to cover the blood of a koi overrides a festival. What is notable about the sounding of the shofar? It is notable in that its definite obligation overrides Shabbat in the temple, as it was sounded in the temple even when Rosh Hashanah occurred on Shabbat. And it is therefore understandable that its uncertain obligation overrides a festival as well. Can you say the same with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood, which does not override Shabbat in any instance? Hey Shiv Rabbi Elozor HaKapar Beribi Ma Lemila Shekin Eino Noheges Belele Yomim Toivim Belele Yomim Toivim Hu Delo Nehaga Bishar Lele Nehaga. The Gemara continues its analysis of the Braita. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, responded with another refutation to Rabbi Yossi's a fortiori inference. One cannot infer from the mitzvah of circumcision that an uncertain obligation to cover the blood of a koi does not override a festival. What is notable about circumcision? It is notable in that it is not in effect on festival nights. Can you say the same with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood, which is in effect on festival nights. The Gemara asks, does Rabbi Elazar HaKapar mean to say that the mitzvah of circumcision is not in effect only on festival nights, but it is in effect on other non-festival nights? Isn't circumcision always performed during the day? Amar Rabbi Abba ze echad me'advarim she'amar Rabbi Chia ein aleihen tshuva v'heishiv Rabbi Lozo b'Rabbi tshuva. The Gemara responds, rather, Rabbi Elazar HaKapar meant the following. What is notable about circumcision? It is notable in that it is not in effect at night as it is by day. Can you say a similar halacha with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood, which is in effect at night as it is by day? Rabbi Abba said this is a kal v'chomer inference drawn by Rabbi Yossi. This kal v'chomer inference drawn by Rabbi Yossi is one of the matters with regard to which Rabbi Chia says that there is no refutation for them. And Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, successfully responded with a refutation. This concludes the Talmud, and we now start the new Mishnah. Hashoiche b'nimtzes treipo, v'hashoiche levalezare, v'hashoiche chullin mifnim v'klotchim b'chutz, chai v'oif haniskolim, chai v'mea mechai v'chachomim poetri. In the case of one who slaughters an undomesticated animal or a bird, and is discovered to be an animal with a wound that would have caused it to die within 12 months, trepa, and in the case of one who slaughters an undomesticated animal or a bird for the sake of idol worship, and in the case of one who slaughters a non-sacred animal or bird inside the temple courtyard, or a sacrificial bird outside the temple courtyard, or in the case of one who slaughters an undomesticated animal, or a bird that was sentenced to be stoned, for example, for killing a person. In all these cases, even though it is prohibited to eat any of these animals or birds, Rabbi Meir deems one obligated to cover their blood, and the rabbis deem one exempt from doing so because, in their opinion, slaughter that is not fit to render the meat permitted for consumption is not considered an act of slaughter. Hashoichet v'nis nablo b'yodeh. One who slaughters an animal or bird and it became a carcass by his hand, meaning the slaughter was performed incorrectly, and one who stabs the animal or bird and one who tears loose the windpipe and the gullet are exempt from covering the blood, as no act of slaughter took place, and one is obligated to cover blood only after a valid slaughter. Now the Gemara says, Zog the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ra, Rabbi Devorav, Shel Rabbi Meir, Boesav Yezbenoi, Ushonoi Beloshin Chachamim, Ud Rabbi Shimon B'chiso Yadam, Ushonoi Belashon Chachamim. With regard to the dispute in the Mishnah about whether an act of slaughter that is not fit to render the meat permitted, renders one obligated to cover the blood, Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yehudanasi, the redactor of the Mishnah, saw as correct the statement of Rabbi Meir, that ineffective slaughter is considered an act of slaughter. With regard to the prohibition against slaughtering the mother and its offspring on the same day, and taught that halacha in the Mishnah on 81b, using the term the rabbis, so that it would be accepted. And he saw, as correct, the statement of Rabbi Shimon, that ineffective slaughter is not considered an act of slaughter with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood, and taught that halacha in the Mishnah here, using the term the rabbis. My time, the Gemara asks, what is the reason that Rabbi Meir holds that ineffective slaughter is considered an act of slaughter in the case of a mother and its offspring? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said he derives his opinion by means of a verbal analogy of the terms slaughter and slaughter. From the case of sacrificial animals slaughtered outside the temple, the verse states with regard to a mother and its offspring, it and its offspring you shall not slaughter in one day. Leviticus 22:28. And the verse states with regard to sacrificial animals, or that is slaughtered outside the camp. Leviticus 17:3. Mahas mshchita she'ena ruya shema shchita afachanami shchita she'ena ruya shema shchita she'ena ruya shema shchita. Accordingly, just as there with regard to one who slaughters an offering outside the temple, it is a case of slaughter that is not fit to render the meat permitted, as one is prohibited from deriving any benefit from such meat. And it is nevertheless considered an act of slaughter to render one liable for slaughtering it outside the temple. So too here, in the case of a mother and its offspring, in an act of slaughter that is not fit to render the meat permitted is considered an act of slaughter, and one is liable. Rabbi Shimon my time, Rabbi Mani bar Patish. We haven't had him in a while. Mani bar Patish. Rabbi Mani bar Patish. Kamar mitavach tavach. V'hachad mai lahalan shchita ruya. Afkan shchita ruya. The Gemara asks, and as for Rabbi Shimon, what is the reason he holds that ineffective slaughter is not considered an act of slaughter? Rabbi Mani bar Patish said, Rabbi Shimon derives his opinion from the verse, slaughter and prepare, for the man shall dine with me at noon. Genesis 43:16. With Joseph, I think. Just as there the verse is referring to an act of slaughter that is fit to render the meat permitted, so too here, in the case of a mother and its offspring, only an act of slaughter that is fit to render the meat permitted is considered an act of slaughter. Wow. Okay. The Gemara suggests, and as for Meir as well, let him derive from Tavoach that only an effective slaughter is considered an act of slaughter. The Gemara responds, according to Rabbi Meir, one derives the halacha with regard to a term of shchita from another instance of the term shchita. One does not derive the halacha with regard to the term of shchita from the term of tevicha. My nafkamina, ha tanir yishmael, vishav hakoin uba hakoin, zohi shiva, zohi biyo. The Gemara asks, being that both terms refer to slaughter, what is the difference? Which one is used? Didn't the school of Rabbi Yishmael teach a verbal analogy with regard to leprosy of houses? The verse states, and the priest shall return on the seventh day, Leviticus 14:39. And another verse with regard to the priest's visit, 7 days later it states, and the priest shall come and took, Leviticus 14:44. This returning and this coming may have the same meaning, and one can therefore derive by verbal analogy that the halacha applies if the leprosy had spread at the conclusion of the first week, applies if it had spread again by the end of the following week. The Gemara responds, this statement of the school of Yishmael applies only where there are no other terms that are identical to it from which one could derive a verbal analogy. But if there is another term that is identical to it, we derive the verbal analogy from a term that is identical to it. Accordingly, Rabbi Meir derives a verbal analogy from an instance of shchita that appears with regard to sacrificial animals that are slaughtered outside the temple. Rabbi Shimon Nami nigmar b'shchutei chutz danin chulin v'chulin vein danin chulin v'chodeshim. The Gemara suggests, and as for Rabbi Shimon as well, let him derive the case of sacrificial animals that were slaughtered outside the temple, that an effective slaughter is considered an act of slaughter. The Gemara responds, Rabbi Shimon holds that one derives the halacha with regard to the slaughter of non-sacred animals from another instance of the slaughter of non-sacred animals, and one does not derive the halacha with regard to the slaughter of non-sacred animals from an instance of the slaughter of the sacrificial animals. The prohibition against slaughtering a mother and its offspring on the same day is stated primarily with regard to non-sacred animals. See 78a. Rabbi Meir atos v'espeno v'kochim milo nahi kainun nekam Rabbi Chiyav ro Rabbi devar Rabbi Meir v'espeno v'shenoi v'nashei chachamim. The Gemara continues, and Rabbi Meir would respond, this is to say that the prohibition against slaughtering a mother and its offspring on the same day does not apply to sacrificial animals. Rather, since the prohibition also applies to sacrificial animals, one can derive its halacha from the case of sacrificial animals that were slaughtered outside the temple. The Gemara comments, this is what Rabbi Yehoshua was referring to when he said that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi saw as correct the statement of Rabbi Meir with regard to the halacha of a mother and its offspring, and taught it in the Mishnah using the term of the rabbis. My time is Rabbi Meir v'chisoy hadam v'rishimon melakish gamar shvicha shvicha mishchutei chutz malal shchita she'enu ruya shema shchita afkan shchita she'enu shema shchita she'enu ruya shema shchita. The Gemara resumes its discussion of the dispute in the Mishnah. What is the reason that Rabbi Meir holds one is obligated in the mitzvah of covering the blood in a case of an effective slaughter? Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, Rabbi Meir derives this from a verbal analogy between the terms pouring and pouring from the case of a sacrificial animal that was slaughtered outside the temple courtyard. One verse states with regard to covering the blood, and he shall pour out its blood, Leviticus 17:13. And one verse states with regard to sacrificial animals slaughtered outside the temple courtyard, he has poured the blood, Leviticus 17:4. Accordingly, just as there with regard to offerings slaughtered outside the temple courtyard, it is as a case of slaughter that is not fit to render the meat permitted, but is nevertheless considered an act of slaughter, so too here, with regard to covering the blood, an act of slaughter that is not fit to render the meat permitted is considered an act of slaughter. Rabbi Shimon Asher Yachel Kisi v'Rabbi Meir Ahu Limute Oif Tameh Hu De'osar Rabbi Shimon Of Tameh My Taimeh Dilav Barachilahu Trefa Nameh Lav Barachilahu. And the Gemara continues, and Rabbi Shimon would respond, it is written with regard to covering the blood, an undomesticated animal or bird that may be eaten. Leviticus 17:13, indicating that the verse is referring specifically to slaughter fit to render the meat permitted for consumption. And Rabbi Meir holds that phrase comes to exclude a ritually impure bird from the mitzvah of covering the blood. And Rabbi Shimon would respond, what is the reason an impure bird is not included in the mitzvah of covering the blood? It is because it is not fit for consumption. If so, a treifa should also not be included in the mitzvah of covering the blood, since it is also not fit for consumption. V'hainu da'am Rabbi Chia ra'a Rabbi Devarov shel Rabbi Shimon b'chisoy hadam u'stenoi b'lashon chachamim. The Gemara comments, and this is what Rabbi Chia is saying when he said that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi saw as correct the statement of Rabbi Shimon with regard to the halacha of covering the blood, and taught it in the Mishnah using the term the rabbis. Abba Rabbi Abba. You know what? This is a new idea. So we'll stop here and start with a new amud, with this new idea.